Morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start our webinar in about 30 seconds with just quite a few people joining, so just give them a few more seconds to get connected. Thank you. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second in our Finance in a Digital World webinars, focused specifically on government and public service organisations. Today we'll focus on two particular topics, fraud and cyber risk, and of course how to mitigate them. Clearly two very topical issues in recent months given the move to digital and online in our new world. And of course, as finance professionals, you'll be very focused on the significant threat and financial exposure that these risks can pose for your organisations. Before we get into the content, I'd like to introduce myself and my fellow presenters. My name is Shane Mohan. I'm a partner in Deloitte Consulting, and I lead the firm's government and public service practice here in Ireland. I'm joined by three of my colleagues, Owen O'Reilly, Ross Grennan, and Ben Lubzensky, all senior leaders in our forensics and risk advisory teams. So maybe before we get into the main presentations, just to set a little bit of context. As we know, COVID-19 has and will continue to have massive healthcare, economic, and indeed social consequences, and of course associated costs. At the same time, essential public services have to be delivered, and other critical national issues such as housing, climate change, and infrastructure have to be addressed. Indeed, last week saw the publication of a hugely ambitious programme for government, and we'll clearly know where that's going over the next number of days. As we discussed in our last webinar, the role of the finance function in any organisation is critical. It's become hugely important for finance functions in public service organisations to bring the governance, the analytics, and the insight to support the many complex funding and expenditure decisions that will have to be made. And these are likely to be tough decisions in coming months, with quite a few trade-offs having to be made. Today we'll be focusing more on the role of finance in safeguarding the organisation's assets. We know that public service organisations are high-profile targets for fraud and cyber attacks, which, as we'll discuss later on, are increasing significantly in scale and scope. The changing work environment is also creating new opportunities for fraud, both from internal and external sources, while posing significant challenges in responding to these threats while working in a remote environment. And of course, the increased pressure on government and resources with a much more immediate need to focus on delivering and maintaining critical services in this time of crisis. And this really challenges our ability and everyone's ability to remain secure and vigilant in the face of these threats. So we're going to move on to our main presentation now, maybe just a couple of housekeeping points before we do so. All attendees will be muted just to avoid any background noise for our presenters. However, we do really want your questions, so please use the question facility on your screen to submit those, and we will come to those at the end of the presentation and try to cover as many as we can. The webinar is being recorded, and we would hope to make that available online at a later point. We'll also circulate some of the slides and materials discussed today by email over the coming days. And contact details for all our presenters are also provided at the slides at the end, should you wish to connect separately with any of the team afterwards. So now I'm going to hand over to Owen O'Reilly for our first presentation on fraud and fraud mitigation.
Thanks very much, Shane. So just moving on to the next slide. So as Shane mentioned, new warnings and examples of fraud have been well published in the media since the onset of COVID-19 in respect to fraud, targeting individuals, companies, but also government entities. So many of you will be aware of the examples that are out there, ranging from classic phishing attempts to counterfeiting to complex webs of cloned companies used to divert funds, etc. I guess one thing to say is that the uptick in fraud isn't really that surprising. We do know from previous examples, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, that fraud does increase in times of crisis. We also do know that fraudsters don't typically miss a good opportunity to commit fraud, and I think we're seeing that playing out in the COVID-19 environment. This does obviously pose challenges to organisations, and I would argue different challenges in this case, as organisations are obviously and understandably more focused on the pressing need to deliver critical services in the new environment. And absolutely, organisations need to protect themselves against the examples I've just mentioned and those highlighted in the media. But I think it's also really important not to lose sight of other fraud types that are potentially lingering in the background that may also go undetected. So I'm going to cover a few of those examples today, and also to outline some key actions that government and public sector entities can take in order to protect themselves. But first, I'm going to start at the beginning, just to set the scene a little and give an overview of what is fraud. So fraud really is a very broad term. There's no universal definition for fraud, and it can certainly take many forms. It can be committed by internal actors, so internal employees, for example, by external third parties outside organisations, and also a combination of both through collusive acts. However, at its centre are always certain key facets. It does always involve a false statement or a deceptive act, which is relied upon to cause damage, usually for financial gain. And from a government and public sector point of view, such sectors are absolutely subject to a myriad of different risks depending on the particular organisation. However, certain common types of public sector fraud, which would be apparent across a wide range of those sectors, include cyber fraud, invoice redirection fraud, fake supplier fraud, application fraud, procurement and overbilling, and of course internal fraud. It's probably not a major shock to hear that the biggest threat that we've seen throughout COVID-19 is cyber fraud, which again is continuing to increase and expected to increase over the next 12 months or so. However, there are other frauds that are also being reported outside of cyber fraud. For example, overbilling is certainly featuring prominently also in the COVID-19 period. So before we move into more specifics around the types of fraud that are out there, I thought it would be useful to examine the conditions within which fraud occurs and also how this is playing out within the current environment. So you may or may not be aware of what's called the fraud triangle. This has been in use for many years, and it's used in order to describe effectively three factors that need to be present in order for fraud to occur. And that's motivation, rationalization, and opportunity. Motivation refers to whether individuals are motivated to commit fraud. This always goes up during a time of crisis. For example, individuals may be subject to pay cuts, they may be subject to shorter working weeks, or indeed they may be under more pressure to cut corners, for example, to meet certain financial or other targets. Rationalization refers to whether an individual can rationalize committing a fraud. For example, this can be borne out in an every man for himself attitude or an everyone else is doing it attitude. And last but certainly not least is opportunity. So COVID-19 has absolutely increased the range of opportunities that are out there to commit fraud, both internally and externally. So we've all seen the scams that are out there, ranging from phishing attempts to malware to fake products. And again, these aren't necessarily new frauds. However, they do have a COVID-19 hook. Remote working as well means offices are empty, but are potentially still accessible. And this does increase the potential for misconduct to occur without detection. It's also possible that policies and procedures aren't being followed in order for processes to effectively function in the remote working environment, albeit on a short-term basis. And also, as I've previously highlighted, management decisions are understandably very much focused on the here and now without having enough time to give due consideration to potentially the longer term consequences from a fraud risk management perspective. I do just think it's useful to reflect upon those three factors and it really gives a good understanding and insight into what are the specific risks that organisations may be faced with. So just moving on to what are the key risks from an external fraud perspective, which are relevant to the government and public sector. So we've all seen and read about them, but just to highlight a few cases in point. Invoice redirection and business compromise fraud has certainly been a feature of the COVID-19 crisis. This is effectively social engineering attempts to divert funds to a fraudulent bank account. Fake invoices and suppliers as well have been used in order for criminals to effectively mask as legitimate businesses to sell counterfeit or as non-existent goods. And I guess maybe just one thing to highlight here, this isn't something that's happening in other parts of the world. We've seen very obvious and real examples of these fraud types happening in Ireland, which have been well reported and publicised in the Irish media. To give just one example, only 2 weeks ago, an Irish firm was tricked, or was reported that an Irish firm was tricked with fake invoices to send €65,000 of a deposit for a machine to manufacture PPE equipment for the HSE. Other examples of fraud that we've seen in COVID-19 includes application fraud. For example, we've seen reports in the media of COVID-19 grant payments being abused by fraudsters. So again, none of these are necessarily new per se, but again, it just goes to show the increases in sophistication that's out there. And again, just to give another example that isn't COVID-19 related, but I think it's still quite interesting. Last year, the Wall Street Journal reported an interesting case of fraudsters using artificial intelligence to mimic a CEO's voice in order to fraudulently divert funds. So again, it just points to the increase in sophistication and methods that are being used by fraudsters in order to pull off their fraud. So one other point just to mention on this, which I found interesting, recently Interpol did highlight that while phishing attempts are starting now to decrease to some degree as we've gone deeper into COVID-19, invoice redirections continue to increase. An invoice redirection only needs to happen once to have a big impact. However, aside from all the different methods and levels of sophistication of the different fraud techniques and threats that are out there, there are some simple things that organisations, including those in the government and public sector, can take in order to protect themselves against these types. And it may seem quite obvious, but it's really important that individuals stay alert, exercise a degree of professional skepticism, in particular if something just doesn't look right, and even more so if a request is tinged with a sense of urgency. It's also really important for organisations to have clear policies and procedures in place and to make sure that those are followed. So I'll just move on to talk about internal fraud risks in the next slide. So again, external fraud risks are probably quite well publicised, and again, they only have to happen once and are often picked up quite quickly. Internal frauds, I guess, are slightly different, but they can also have quite a big impact. However, it's possible that they can go unnoticed for a longer period of time. And again, I think it's really important for organisations, including those in the government and public sector, to ask themselves, what are the particular red flags that are relevant for their business, which may be indicative of internal fraud occurring? And just some non-exhaustive examples to give a flavour of what those might look like. They include individuals who are bypassing policies and procedures, lack of segregation of duties, out of office hour logins, new suppliers or vendors being onboarded that just don't make sense, or also generous staff behaviour that just doesn't add up even in the COVID-19 environment. And then just moving on to the wider control environment. So how do organisations manage the myriad of risks to which they're exposed, especially in the COVID-19 environment? But first to say that many firms already have well-established fraud risk management frameworks in place across the prevent, detect and respond spectrum. So that includes preventative measures including fraud risk assessments, fraud governance and policies and procedures, training, to detective measures including manual and automated monitoring controls, whistleblowing policies, so on and so forth, right up to fraud response plans and mobilising fraud task forces in the event that fraud actually occurs. And undoubtedly, all of these components give good protection to organisations in the fight against fraud. However, now is really a good time to revisit some of those components to make sure that you're confident that you're adequately protected within the COVID-19 environment. For example, revisiting risk assessments will allow you to identify potentially new risks to which you're exposed within COVID-19, but also to identify additional controls that might be useful in protecting yourself. Secondly, roles and responsibilities and resources are important. It's important to understand if you've got adequate resources to prevent and detect fraud, but also to make sure that those resources are in the right area of your organisation. From a roles and responsibilities point of view, it's very important that they're well articulated, laid out and cascaded throughout your organisation so that everybody knows their part to play within preventing and detecting fraud within the organisation. It's also important to think about key internal controls and reviewing those. For example, segregation of duties, and are there any chinks in the armour there? And also thinking about any approval controls and making sure that they're not blunted in a remote working environment. Training is also a good and potentially straightforward control to revisit and put in place. That's not only effective in making sure that awareness is raised throughout the organisation and to make sure that everybody has a good handle on the frauds that are out there and the controls in place in the organisation, but it also acts as a really good deterrent against would-be fraudsters within the organisation. Lastly, just to say, third-party suppliers is another area that's important to make sure there are good controls around. This is particularly the case for any new suppliers that were onboarded or fast-tracked within the COVID-19 pandemic, which understandably may have happened in order to gain access to critical services or products. However, that may expose the organisation to potential vulnerabilities also from a fraud perspective. So all of those things are immediate actions that firms and organisations can take in order to prevent and protect themselves against fraud in the current environment. However, now is also a really good opportunity to consider the use of data and how that can help unlock an analytics-led approach to fraud risk management and to increase your organisation's resilience in the future. This clearly has a number of benefits, including identifying fraud more effectively, more efficiently, and more quickly. And it's very effective in automatically spotting irregularities which may otherwise go undetected by tired eyes, for example, or may go unnoticed for a long period of time. So in terms of data analytics-led approach, I'll now hand over to Ross, who will walk you through what data analytics-led approach looks like for fraud risk management.
Thank you very much, Owen, and good morning, everyone. Organisations around the world are needing to respond to an ever more complex environment in their attempts to tackle economic crime, abuse and misconduct. Perpetrators are smarter and one step ahead of traditional fraud detection capabilities. Regulators, backed by increased levels of global legislation, are demanding deeper visibility into risk and exposure, while the public are demanding greater visibility into their exposures. Organisations that use technology to proactively monitor for potential risks, as well as data analytics to identify new emerging threats, are likely to be better positioned to mitigate the blind spots in their corporate misconduct offences and address the risk of being blindsided from a financial, operational, legal and reputational perspective. Our recent 2019 survey has shown that only 63% of executives are confident that employees will speak up about a code of conduct violation, even though 98% had whistleblowing services in place. Reliance on culture, employee vigilance, and preparedness to speak up is simply no longer sufficient. Despite the challenges, organizations can take several steps to prepare an effective foundation for an analytics-driven monitoring capability, but the overriding principle should always be to start small, pick smart, and drive value. Focus in the effort. Rather than casting net wide or investing heavily in one technology solution, consider conducting a focused proof of concept to understand the mechanics of analytics-driven approach and to demonstrate value that it can provide. A data-led monitoring capability can only be ever as good as the data which is at base, so good governance is essential and is to enable you to set up things for success. Resource skill set. Analytical skills are in short supply, and that's doubly true for analysts that have more than quantitative skills. Finding people who are capable of deriving insights from data is extremely difficult and is the biggest challenge that we face within Deloitte and also our clients face. The use of data analytics. Different risks may require different analytical approaches, and it's important to have an awareness of what those approaches could be. Clustering and anomaly detection use statistical profiles to identify normal activity and then differentiate outliers from these profiles. Supervised modeling uses prior economic crime, abuse, and misconduct data to allow the computer to learn the characteristics and early warning signs and identify others with similar behavior. Too often, organizations believe that building an analytical-led organization comes down to hiring a squadron of data scientists armed with PhDs, yet this is proving to not be enough. The reality is that high-performing analytical teams include a mix of people with red skills, so your software developers, your data architects, your data scientists, and your information designers, and people with blue skills, so your finance managers, subject matter experts, and design thinkers, a combination that fosters the development of what we refer to in Deloitte as purple teams. When it comes to the creation of purple teams, upskilling your current employees is by far the most popular method of building your organization's analytical capabilities. When it comes to structuring your teams, there's a number of approaches that can be taken. For example, hiring people with purple potential, those who both understand the analytical process and have a business instinct. When we build our teams within Deloitte, we try to hire data analysts that have more than quantitative skills. The best analysts have an understanding of the analytical process, but also have advisory instincts, the ability to think through a business problem, and leadership skills, the ability to get buy-in for the analytical journey. You could share expertise by seconding your resources to different locations, rotating people to different business units, building cross-functional teams, and encouraging people with the red skills to act as mentors to blue. When people experience upskilling with blue skills, is probably the easiest way to get an understanding of the analytical process. When we deliver analytics projects for our clients, we tend to follow 6 key phases. These steps are followed no matter how big or small the project is, as these are the fundamentals to delivering a successful data analytics project. The first step, business process walkthrough and mapping. This involves working collaboratively with the business and end users to understand the process being tested. Step 2, develop an analytical work plan. What that means is once we have an updated understanding of the processes that the organization utilize, you want to develop a detailed work plan which captures the key processes, the key risks, and how each of those will be tested analytically and what data will be required to support the testing. The next step is to source, load, and structure your data. This involves getting the required data from the business to support your analysis. This can be done in many ways, from using specialized data connectors or working directly with the IT team to extract the data. Once the data is received, it is loaded, structured, and it's available for testing. Data validation is one of the most important activities that data analysts need to perform. Data validation ensures that your data is complete, you've no blank or null values, it's unique, it contains the distinct values that are non-duplicated, and the range of values that you've received are consistent with the understanding gleaned through step 1. Data validation is crucial as it ensures that the data your team are using is accurate, complete, and is fully understand how the data needs to be interpreted. Throughout my career, any projects where mistakes have been made, the root cause always comes down to data validation not being performed correctly and accurately by the team. Step 5, develop and run your analytics. You run your detailed analytical tests to identify exceptions and areas of non-compliance. You design interactive data visualization dashboards, and you validate the findings to the baseline business operations, and then you refine your testing based on the understanding that you receive as part of the validation sessions. The final step and the part of the process that yields the greatest value is your insights generation and reporting. This involves in-depth analysis of the outputs to derive insights and identify business improvement opportunities. Finding people who are capable of doing this is extremely difficult, and the skills required to be successful at this phase combines a combination of technical skills, analytical skills, business understanding, and awareness. This is where your purple teams come to the fore. This slide here provides a simple overview of how a procurement and accounts payable analytical project would look like to identify areas of potential fraud. On the left-hand side, you see some of the key data sets that would be required to be sourced in order for the project to be successful. They include the vendor master file. Vendor master file would be simply your list of vendors with contact dates, when they're added, their vendor address information, bank account details to be able to support looking for duplicate vendors. You would also source your purchase requisitions, purchase orders, good receipts, invoices, and your payments data. The data would be collected and then loaded into a central repository, be it an SQL database or an Oracle database, where your data would be structured, loaded, and then set up for validation and modeling. On the right-hand side is a simple visualization output that would help to support identification of anomalies and then uncover any business insights that may be derived. Vendor clustering and vendor risk scores prioritize entities for review based on differences from the baseline activities. For example, a high volume of vendors with invoices without purchase orders raised after invoice receipts, or duplicate invoices would mark that vendor as a higher risk score and be one that you'd want to follow up on. Similar to what Owen talked about around adding new vendors to the vendor master file with high levels of spend or reduced spend and their profile changing, you want to detect that early so you can follow up and understand what's happening and identify if that's a potential fraudulent red flag. So some key takeaways then. Data is the only resource we're getting more of every day, and that resource is growing in both volume and value. Given the current global pandemic, the situation a lot of organizations have been forced into will expose weaknesses in their control environment, and we will see a spike in fraudulent activity by both individuals and businesses. This spike may be through making fraudulent claims under new support schemes that are offered by government bodies, or through overcharging of suppliers and customers. Utilizing data analytics provides significant benefits by providing proactive detection, helping to identify business exposures, anomalies detections, and enhance business processes. Thank you for your time this morning. I'm now going to hand you over to my colleague Ben, who will introduce cyber within the government and public services domain, current activities witnessed by Deloitte, and considerations for developing strong cyber security capabilities.
Good morning. Thank you, Ross. I'd like to just introduce you to cyber here. It's probably one of the enablers of the aforementioned topics. What we are currently seeing, and a number of activities that can be done to try and reduce this risk holding. So declared by NATO as the 5th domain after land, air, sea and space, the operational domain of cyber is everywhere. It's go everywhere. So unconstrained by geographical boundaries, it's widespread, and it is an interconnected digital technology. The 4th industrial revolution is driving this with its increasingly global, digital and interconnected world. But with these new opportunities come many new threats. And effective cyber risk management gives leaders the confidence to take full advantage of these technological opportunities. And greater confidence can enable your organizations to realize innovation-powered growth whilst evolving securely. Here in Deloitte, we help clients drive the world forwards with our in-depth technical knowledge, breadth and industry expertise, and offer a comprehensive suite of cyber solutions to address these end-to-end client needs. Our cyber risks management services include strategy, security, vigilance, and resilience. Now, this is real. This is happening today. You've probably seen the news about Australia with the exploitation of public-facing infrastructure using remote code execution, tackling or attacking unpatched systems, and very much using open source available tools. There's also intelligence that suggests that the threat actor here is conducting reconnaissance operations to generate and gather knowledge for potential future attacks. And they've been achieving this via spear phishing, providing links to dodgy websites. They've also been achieving this with emails containing malicious files. Now, the government and public services industry has been and will continue to be one of the most highly targeted of all industries. The range of threats to government entities range from the most trivial spear phishing attack all the way through to the most advanced multi-stage attacks that start with a zero-day exploit. Similarly, the skill sets of the threat actors targeting government entities range from completely inexperienced to the most proficient nation-state groups. Threat actors targeting government entities include disgruntled citizens, activists, cyber criminals, cyber mercenaries, and other nation states. They're typically targeted for one of 3 main reasons, either socio-political issues, financial gain, or espionage. In the case of socio-political issues, the attacker wants to bring to light something they perceived as injustice or wrong, possibly by public shaming of a victim or try and enact or force a change in law or policy. Financial gain covers many aspects as it relates to government entities. It may include the sale of personally identifiable information, which with it comes fines, personal health information, user credentials, access to the networks, some sort of blackmail, or what we have seen an increase in is ransomware. Governments hold a vast amount of information that is critical to the functioning of defence of their nation. The data covers a broad range of areas, including budgetary information, political and military strategic plans, information related to criminals, espionage, and terrorism investigations, as well as other intelligence that's been acquired through clandestine means. All this information is of great value to a wide range of nation-state actors. Due to the vast subject areas that government entities have to cover, the fact that budgets are tight across all levels, they are forced typically to work with what Deloitte refers to as the intellectual supply chain. These are personas such as think tanks, lobbyists, and academic institutions. By the nature of the shared work, organisation and government entities have a very close working relationship, oftentimes based on personal friendships. This makes this intellectual supply chain a lucrative target for threat actors. And the intellectual supply chain entities are typically smaller and have less advanced security programs protecting them. Many attackers are aware of this and will seek to exploit these weaker security controls, compromising the supplier, the intellectual supplier, before springboarding onto their ultimate target within the government. Government entities therefore need to be aware at all levels of the threats targeting them, and the security teams need to understand the traffic on their networks so that they can filter out and investigate the unexpected. This will help your security teams uncover the unexpected threats quickly and begin the remediation process. A few key challenges that we've captured are the supply chain, as we've mentioned, the intellectual supply chain, but not to forget the traditional supply chain. Vulnerability exposures. Many of the companies require similar networking hardware and web application software to support all their network-based computing requirements. The common denominator for both areas is software. Despite the best efforts of software developers, bugs and improper designs in the software can open the attack surface area to be exploited by attackers. Equally, networking hardware requires software to function, so most of which is available for malicious actors to purchase and reverse engineer, where they may be looking for software bugs that they can exploit to gain control of the devices and/or modify their configurations to use them as a springboard to gain access into the networks in which they are protecting. Many of these devices live on the edge of the network, exposed to the internet, making them an enticing target. In a few cases, the exploit of the network-based hardware can be as trivial as reading the user's manual. Most hardware ships from the manufacturer with default well-known passwords, and it's fundamental security best practice to immediately change these default passwords. However, this step is sometimes skipped and forgotten, and the hardware is left open to anyone who may try the default password. Most companies have some sort of web presence to draw attention of customers, investors, and potential employees, and government entities are no different, with a web presence to inform the public of research, proposed laws, hearings, conferences, and requests for proposals, job openings, etc. Like networking hardware, there are common software applications that run these web services. Some are commercial and some are open source. As with networking hardware, attackers are attempting to find bugs in the applications that will enable them to exploit the software to gain access to the servers that are hosting these applications. These web applications also have to be internet facing, and many have minimal security controls placed in front of them. Another threat we have identified as being prevalent at the moment is the insider, your staff and your employees. Now, these fall into two categories: the malicious insider and the ignorant and complacent. Now, not the most common, but potentially the more devastating and costly is the malicious insider, an actor who is sufficiently motivated to take devastating, unauthorized, illegal, or fraudulent actions. It is difficult to detect their actions as they are already on the inside, past the front door, past the perimeter monitoring and defenses, and they can have legitimate access to sensitive data and critical operations and systems. They may also have sufficient privileges that they can bypass internal controls. So what makes a malicious insider? Well, particularly pertinent in these times is the fear of redundancy. But it can equally be something like job dissatisfaction or financial worries. Now, the more common, though, is the ignorant and complacent insider. These are people with no malicious intent, and they are often just keen to achieve their roles effectively and efficiently, but in doing so, potentially take risks. They're also potentially likely to fall foul to threat actors' engagements, such as phishing, and this is particular within the current climate, where threat actors are looking at phishing campaigns, leveraging the public fear and uncertainty in the COVID-19 climate, such as personal health, family, job, financial security, or business disruption. Now, also for government entities is geopolitical conflict. And with this, there are three main uses for cyber within the realm of geoconflict. The first is the use of cyber for destructive purposes, such as polluting the water, turning the power off, turning the telecommunications off. The second is the use of capabilities within the geoconflict is specifically targeting to gather intelligence to be used for whatever medium that particular conflict is being fought on at that particular point of time, whether that be kinetic, political, or clandestine. And the last common usage of cyber information within the geopolitical realm is for psyops and disinformation campaigns, as been speculated around a number of votes and government works. More recently in the current environment, we have witnessed the increase in the following activity, and that being financial compensation and stimulus bill lures. Here, threat actors are leveraging the current crisis and pursuing stimulus check payments and financial aid from governments to businesses and individuals in their social engineering lures to deliver malicious payloads. Several lures have been related to stimulus checks, unemployment compensation, and small business loans, as well as COVID-19 themed campaigns with grant, payment, or economic recovery themed emails and attachments. For example, individuals at a financial service organization in the United States were sent an email with the subject line, "Internal guidance for business grant and loans in response to COVID-19. These emails had open document presentation that, when unopened within Microsoft, displayed a small US Business Administration themed message and an inline link that redirects to malicious code. We've also seen websites selling fake products and services. Threat actors have been registering a plethora of domains related to keywords such as coronavirus and COVID to distribute fake products such as masks, protective gear, hand sanitizer, pandemic survival kits, and also setting up fake donation sites. And we have also seen an increase in business email compromise, where they've used coronavirus themed emails via financial reports or outstanding invoices. One example was about a financial institution that received an email allegedly from the CEO of a company who had previously scheduled a transfer of funds, requesting that the transfer date be moved up and the recipient amount be changed due to coronavirus outbreak and quarantine processes and precautions. Another example involved a bank customer who received an email from an alleged client requesting that all invoice payments be changed to a different bank account because their regular bank account was inaccessible due to coronavirus orders. We've also witnessed this where the email has been sent to the incorrect department, and being collaborative, the incorrect department forwarded it to the correct department for action. This makes it particularly difficult to detect because now the request has come from a known source internally to your organization. Next slide, please. What can be done to instill confidence in leadership to take full advantage of technological opportunities to confidently realize innovation-powered growth and do this securely? And for this, we've broken this down into 4 best practices. The first is identify. Develop an organizational understanding to manage cybersecurity risks to systems, people, and assets and data, but also consider your operational capability. This can be installed through clear strategies, objectives, and communications, a clear organizational structure, the delivery of training and testing, and just to name a few. Understanding what is critical to the operations and regularly maintaining this knowledge base is key. Vulnerabilities are continuously being identified by vendors, security testers, threat hunters, threat actors in both new and old technologies and systems. Assessing your exposure to these vulnerabilities is complex, and identifying the right course of action to follow to mitigate these risks requires deep knowledge. The second is protect. Develop and implement appropriate safeguards to ensure delivery of critical services. Evaluate security through proactive and authorized exploration of system vulnerabilities. Here, attacks can be simulated in a realistic yet controlled manner, using many of the same tools, techniques, and procedures of a genuine attacker might use. We also say detect. Develop and implement appropriate activities to identify the occurrence of a cybersecurity event. An effective detection capability provides a confident environment for organizations to achieve its core objectives in line with its strategic goals against the ever-changing cyber threat landscape. Solutions such as managed detection response capabilities can enable the ability to respond quickly to high-fidelity security alerts, initiate the appropriate incident response, and perform effective mitigating actions. Consider cost-effective solutions such as hybrid delivery models with managed security service providers, and be sure to implement the chosen solution in a manner that delivers value as soon as possible, focusing on your core assets that enable, and this will enable the signal to be seen in the noise. The average time to detection of a cyber breach is circa 200 days. So the quicker a detection can be conducted, the quicker the response, and then the subsequent reduction in potential impact. Additionally, if you're using or integrating solutions with third-party vendors or partners, consider how they are managing the detection capabilities and assure yourself that this is being done effectively. Prior to any integration, consider the conduct of a threat hunt to reduce the risk of a system being integrated or introducing unwanted threat actors or pen test for potential vulnerabilities. And finally, respond. Develop and implement appropriate activities to take action regarding a detected cybersecurity incident. It's becoming increasingly likely that an attack will get through an organization's defenses and security controls. When this does occur, organizations must be able to respond fast, thoroughly, and decisively. We've witnessed an increase in insider threats, and also don't forget your third-party vendors in your intellectual and your traditional supply chains. Consider how, in the event of an incident, how you will collaboratively work together to address this event and practice. Services such as the IE Cyber Incident Response are also there available to support in the case of an emergency. Thank you for your time. Now I'll pass you back to Owen for a summary, conclusion, and our considerations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. So we've gone through a lot of content today, which hopefully you found interesting, and I look to recap on some of the key points from today. So I guess while undoubtedly there are challenges posed to government and public sector organisations by fraud and cyber, there are some practical next steps and things that you can do to protect your organisation and to take advantage of new ways to manage risk. So firstly, I think you've probably heard from both myself and Ben, it's important to know your risks and to conduct a risk assessment from both a cyber and a fraud perspective. Second of all, it's important to have clear roles and responsibilities in relation to managing cyber and fraud risk across the organisation, and to make sure that's well cascaded throughout and well understood. I think undertaking these 2 points gives you a really good platform to build on. In order to put a data analytics approach in place, setting out a data strategy is important to identify, collect, and to be able to understand the data that's at your disposal. That includes both structured data and unstructured data. This is also a very useful exercise for ensuring you've got good data controls in the right places in your business from a cyber perspective. As we've mentioned, and as Ross mentioned, start small. Focus on the area where you think will make the biggest impact and take it from there. And using an agile approach in this regard is certainly helpful. And lastly, follow a multidisciplinary approach. So for example, in order to leverage solutions, technology solutions in the future, it is important to pair the traditional finance skills that you would traditionally find within a finance function with other skills such as data analytics skills. It's also important to have an integrated approach. You can see how cyber and fraud can blend together, and it's important that these topics are looked at in an integrated fashion and not in isolation. And I think ensuring they're integrated makes sure your controls make the biggest impact. So certainly aligning on all of these elements is a great step in positioning organisations in government and public sector to be resilient in the face of fraud and cyber challenges in the future.
Great, thanks very much. A big thanks to Owen and to Ross and to Ben for sharing their experience with our attendees this morning. We've a good few questions, so I'm going to try and get through a number of those. And we still have a little time. If people would like to ask questions, again, please feel free to do so. If by chance we don't get to them all, and we probably won't, we might just summarize some of the more popular ones. And again, when we send some of the slides, etc. later, we might just address a few of those. But maybe just to kick off, and I'm going to pose this first question probably to both Owen and to Ben, notwithstanding there's obvious overlaps between fraud and cyber. But the question was around the prevalence of these incidents. I mean, is it affecting 1 in 10 organizations, 1 in 100? Could you maybe comment on that? Maybe Owen, if you want to start, and Ben?
Absolutely, I can start. I mean, you only really have to look at the news to see that it's happening. So I mean, in terms of is it prevalent, it is. I think, as I mentioned, the external fraud events are probably the ones that are in the forefront of people's minds. Internal fraud is probably ones that are more on the back burner, but typically every organisation is subject to a level of internal fraud. So it absolutely is prevalent, albeit internal fraud is typically something that is less maybe explicit within an organisation. And I guess that's the challenge that internal fraud poses alongside the external fraud threats.
Yeah, I think certainly today, threat actors have and always will try and leverage current climate ongoings. Today it's COVID-19. We're looking at potentially entering a number of economic challenges, and it's likely that it would look to leverage that. And what the cyberspace and the digital connectivity has enabled them to do is provide access. As I said, it's ungeographically constrained now. So whereas once before, traditionally, you would have had to have had physical access, now this can be done digitally, and you can also reach larger numbers and influence them more greatly. We're seeing this in Australia, and you don't need to be particularly sophisticated to conduct some of these things. As I said, the threat actor scope is massive now. But I'd say the key thing is, have you detected it? I'd say yes, it is happening prevalently, but are you aware of it? Do you have the detection capabilities? And if you do detect it, do you know what has been achieved by the threat actor? Do you have you practiced what you can do to prevent it and reduce the impact and mitigate against it, and practice?
Very good. Ben, I'll just stick with you for the next question. There was one around remote working, and over the last three months or so, for huge numbers of people in our public services and economy generally. Again, presumably the question is that's giving huge increase to the number of incidents.
Yeah, certainly. Our threat intelligence capabilities have identified threat actors looking to leverage this distributed working environment. Certainly with the sort of rush nature in the lockdown that was introduced and the way it was implemented. And we have to bear in mind that the IT support teams and the security support teams were equally caught up in the lockdown procedures. So we're also looking and learning to develop and deliver their own capabilities and functions whilst in lockdown. We've seen components such as hijacking of personal home routers, where threat actors have compromised personnel home routers because of potentially they are left unpatched or rely on weak default account credentials. We've seen compromises of virtual private networks, the digital link used to enable personnel to work from home and reach into their original employees' networks, where we've seen potentially the lack of security that might be witnessed in enterprises, and also employees not accustomed to working from home could have had difficulty in setting up these VPNs. And we've also seen an increase, as I've said, in the credential phishing emails, where threat actors have tried to spoof domains, whether that be email IDs from government bodies, to send out phishing emails with the idea to redirect recipients to websites with malicious code and also siphon off credentials. So yes, we have seen this increase, and we refer to this as sort of the increase in the attack surface area, i.e. the points at which a threat actor can engage to you, and they will test this perimeter to look for the weak points.
Very good. Thanks, Ben. Ross, just to keep it fair, there's a question here, probably best suited to yourself, because you did comment on the kind of skills that are required to both defend against these kind of fraud incidences or indeed detect them when they have happened. Are organizations building that capability themselves? Are they hiring people? Are they training people? How do they go about it generally?
They're trying, a lot of them are now trying to hire people in, but they're trying to build that capability internally, because at the end of the day, people within your business know your business probably more intimately and more effectively, and then they sometimes require external resources to come in and provide the technical support. But like upskilling a team to understand the basics of analytics is way easier than trying to teach a technical person all the intricacies around accounts payable, procurement, fraud, finance functions. So we've always worked and flipped it the other way of saying, let's find people that have an interest in the technical aspect and then train them up, and then they become the bridge. So like within Deloitte, we've had issues with trying to have we do a lot of work with our external audit team. So using analytics to do a statutory external audit and help that team, but you have a core accountant, you have a technical person on the right-hand side, and they just don't compute. So we attack that by saying, let's have analytics champions that sit in audit that have an interest in the technical component, and they act as that intermediary and the bridge. So similar to myself and Owen, I'm in the analytics team, Owen's in the forensic and fraud team. We work together and we act as the bridge into the technical parts of our teams, and that works quite well because it's very, very difficult to take a core technical person and then lift them in to have that business understanding.
Yeah. But very often it's about mixing skills available in the organization in the right way. Yeah, great.
And again, like your business people that work in your business every day will understand what an outlier is, understand what's a standard operating procedure, as opposed to what you didn't normally expect.
Yeah, cool. Very good, Ross. Thanks. Ben, there's a bit of interest in Australia, probably not surprising given we're talking to a lot of folks who work in government departments and other state agencies. Yeah, I think if I could probably summarize some of the questions really into one, it's asking, can a government really defend, when some orchestrated campaign is directed at the country, can a government defend that really?
That's a very good question. I think this is as the environment evolves and as the understanding evolves so I think traditionally cyber warfare would have been considered or constrained to sort of the military and central government functions. But in this space over the last decade, it has also been identified that the critical functioning of a state is far more reliant than just on the core government functions, the military, the police, for example. It relies highly on power generation, communication, water supply, payment, financial institutions, all the critical national infrastructure. And much of this has been outsourced, is supplied by third-party vendors. So the big change has been, how can governments better equip the entire nation and its people to defend against these attacks? Because a sophisticated nation-state actor can get in and leverage it at every level, and they can equally use third parties to make this more complex. I think ultimately it will happen. It will happen, and the attack surface area is massive. But we can do a lot as a state to reduce the impact of any of these, as I think Australia is learning today through its effective communications from its central government to the state. In the case of Australia, the attacking doesn't seem to be particularly sophisticated. It doesn't appear to be using any sophisticated attack methodologies. Everything seems to be fairly, if you will, sort of open source attacks, and it's going against public-facing infrastructure, so the websites and things. And it seems to be trying to pull out where there's been poor patch management, for example. So a number of core things that could be taken would be make sure your systems are patched and promote this and support one another in achieving that. Also look at multi-factor authentication capabilities to ensure that the user who they say they are in logging into that system. And a final one, which I think is really putting it strong, is, you know, keep your logs. Make sure that your logs are accessible, constrained, and up to date, because that's the source of information that can be used by incident response teams, IT departments, and security teams in understanding what's going on, understanding what data, if potentially, has been extracted, and where the gaps in the fence are, if you will, where the weaknesses are, so that, one, they can respond to the incident effectively and efficiently, but secondly, they can upskill, increase the maturity of their organization to prevent a similar attack from happening in the future.
Great. Okay, Ben, thanks a million. I'm quite conscious of time. It's now 11:25. I think we'll draw the webinar to a close. I'd again like to thank Ross and Owen and Ben for sharing their knowledge and insight and experience with us. You'll see our email addresses up there on the screen. If anyone would like to contact any of the team or myself, again, please feel free to do so. And as I said at the beginning of the webinar, we will circulate some of the materials by email over the next number of days. So again, thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend. I hope it was a useful hour out of your day, and look forward to talking to many of you in the future. Goodbye, and thank you.
Thank you.